The stagecoach wheels ground to a halt in the dusty main street of Willow Creek, Arizona Territory, 1882. As the door swung open, a young woman stepped down with graceful dignity that seemed almost otherworldly against the harsh frontier backdrop. Her name was Elena Martinez, and she carried herself with the quiet strength of someone who had learned to survive in two worlds while belonging fully to neither. What the townspeople couldn't know as they stared was that Elena's journey to this remote settlement would challenge everything they believed about worth, belonging, and the courage it takes to fight for love in a world determined to deny it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Arizona Territory as Elena Martinez clutched her worn leather satchel and surveyed Willow Creek for the first time. The town was larger than she had expected, with a main street lined by wooden buildings that spoke of recent prosperity, a general store, a bank, a hotel with fresh paint, and a church with a bell tower that reached toward the endless desert sky. But it was the stairs that captured her attention first. Men in dusty work clothes paused their conversations to look at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to something harder and less welcoming. Women in calico dresses whispered behind their hands, their eyes taking in every detail of her appearance with calculating precision. Elena understood their reaction. At 24, she possessed a striking beauty that came from her mixed heritage, her mother's Apache blood evident in her high cheekbones and dark, intelligent eyes, while her father's Spanish ancestry showed in her olive complexion and the elegant way she carried herself. Her black hair was arranged in a style that attempted to conform to Eastern fashion, but there was something untamed about her that no amount of careful grooming could completely disguise. The dress she wore was her finest, deep green wool, with ivory trim that she had sewn herself during the long journey from Santa Fe. It was practical, yet elegant, designed to make a good first impression on the man who had agreed to marry her sight unseen. James Patterson had seemed kind in his letters, describing himself as a successful merchant who valued intelligence and character over conventional beauty. What James Patterson hadn't mentioned in their 6-month correspondence was that he expected his mail-order bride to be white. Elena approached the address she had memorized, Patterson's General Store, with measured steps that betrayed none of the anxiety building in her chest. Through the large front windows, she could see shelves, stocked with goods that suggested the prosperity James had described in his letters. Bolts of fabric, household items, tools and supplies that served the growing community of ranchers and miners who had made Willow Creek their home. The bell above the door announced her entrance with a cheerful jingle that seemed to mock the sudden silence that fell over the store's interior. 3 customers, 2 women and an elderly man, turned to stare at her with expressions that shifted from curiosity to recognition to something colder. Behind the counter stood a man she immediately recognized from his own description, tall, with thinning brown hair and pale blue eyes that had seemed kind in the photograph he had sent. James Patterson was younger than she had expected, perhaps 35, with soft hands that spoke of indoor work and a face that suggested comfort rather than hardship. But it was the expression on that face, shock giving way to horror, and then to barely concealed revulsion that told Elena everything she needed to know about her future in Willow Creek. "James Patterson," she said quietly, her voice carrying the slight accent that revealed her Spanish upbringing. "I'm Elena Martinez. I believe you're expecting me." The silence in the store became oppressive. One of the women customers, a sharp-faced matron in expensive clothing, audibly gasped. The elderly man muttered something under his breath that Elena couldn't quite hear, but understood from his tone. James Patterson's face had gone pale, his eyes darting from Elena to his customers and back again. When he spoke, his voice carried a nervous tremor that hadn't been present in their earlier correspondence. "Miss Martinez," he began, stumbling over her name, "there seems to have been some misunderstanding. Perhaps we should discuss this matter privately." But the sharp-faced woman stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "James Patterson, surely you're not considering going through with this arrangement. Look at her. She's clearly got Indian blood. What will people think?" Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she maintained her composure. She had faced such prejudice before, though never at such a crucial moment in her life. "Mrs." she began politely. "Mrs. Rebecca Whitman," the woman replied coldly, "and I speak for the decent families of this community when I say that we have standards to maintain." James Patterson seemed to find his voice, though it shook with nervous energy. "Elena, Miss Martinez, I'm afraid there's been a terrible mistake. Your letters never mentioned your ancestry. If you had known what?" Elena interrupted, her own voice gaining strength. "That my mother was Apache, that my father was Spanish. I wrote to you about my skills as a seamstress, my education, my desire to build a life with a partner who valued character over appearance. Which of those qualities has changed because of my heritage?" The challenge hung in the air between them, and Elena could see from James's expression that he had no answer that wouldn't reveal the depth of his prejudice. The man who had written eloquently about seeking a wife with intelligence and moral character was confronted with the reality that his noble words meant nothing when faced with social pressure. "It's not about your qualities," he said weakly. "It's about what's practical, what people will accept. I have a business to consider, a reputation in this community." Mrs. Whitman nodded approvingly. "Exactly right. Willow Creek is a respectable town with Christian values. We can't have mixed marriages setting a bad example for our children." Elena looked around the store at the faces watching her, some curious, some hostile, all judging her by standards she could never hope to meet simply because of who her parents had been. The weight of exhaustion settled over her like a physical burden. She had traveled for 3 days on dusty stagecoaches, spending nearly every dollar she possessed to reach this place that was supposed to become her home. "I see," she said quietly. "And what exactly do you propose I do now, Mr. Patterson? I've spent my life savings to travel here based on your promise of marriage. I have no family, no resources, and nowhere else to go." James Patterson's discomfort was obvious, but he seemed incapable of moving beyond his own social fears to address the practical reality of Elena's situation. Perhaps you could find work somewhere else. Santa Fe, maybe, where your background would be more accepted." "With what money?" Elena asked. "I trusted your word, Mr. Patterson. I gave up my position, sold my belongings, and traveled across the territory based on your assurances. Are you simply abandoning me to whatever fate awaits a woman alone in a frontier town?" The question forced James to confront the full implications of his rejection, and Elena could see the internal battle playing out across his features. Whatever moral conscience he possessed was at war with his desire for social acceptance, and it was clear which force was stronger. Mrs. Whitman supplied the final push he needed. "Mr. Patterson, surely you understand that helping her now would only encourage others of her kind to think they can force their way into respectable society. Sometimes difficult decisions are necessary to maintain proper standards." The cruel dismissal crystallized something hard and cold in Elena's chest. She had known prejudice before, but never had it been wielded so systematically to destroy her life. Looking at these people, their comfortable clothes, their well-fed faces, their absolute certainty that they had the right to determine her worth based on her bloodline, she felt something shift inside her. "I understand perfectly," she said, her voice carrying new steel. You're cowards who hide behind social conventions because you lack the courage to judge people by their actions rather than their ancestry. The accusation sent shocked murmurs through the small group, but Elena continued, her dark eyes blazing with controlled fury. James Patterson, you wrote to me about seeking a partner with character and intelligence. But when faced with the choice between honoring your commitments and maintaining your social standing, you've revealed exactly how much character you possess. James's face flushed red. Now, see here, Miss Martinez, I won't be lectured about character by someone who misrepresented herself in correspondence. Misrepresented? Elena's voice rose slightly. I told you I was educated by missionaries, that I spoke 3 languages, that I could sew, cook, and manage a household. Which of those statements was false? You know perfectly well what you concealed, Mrs. Whitman interjected. Decent people have a right to know what they're getting involved with. Elena turned to face the older woman directly. And what exactly are you getting involved with, Mrs. Whitman? I'm a woman seeking to build an honest life through marriage and hard work. If that threatens your sense of decency, perhaps the problem lies with your understanding of what decency means. The confrontation might have escalated further, but the store door opened to admit another customer. Elena turned to see a man entering, who immediately commanded attention despite, or perhaps because of, his obvious attempts to avoid it. He was tall and lean, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. His clothes were practical, leather vest, worn denim, boots that had seen hard use, and he moved with the controlled grace of someone accustomed to danger. But it was the scars that made people stare. A network of thin white lines across the left side of his face that spoke of violence survived and pain endured. The newcomer surveyed the tense scene in the store with intelligent eyes, his gaze lingering on Elena before moving to James Patterson and Mrs. Whitman. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried an authority that immediately shifted the dynamic in the room. Afternoon, Patterson, ma'am. He touched his hat brim in Elena's direction, a gesture of respect that hadn't been offered by anyone else present. Looks like I might be interrupting something. James Patterson seemed relieved by the interruption. Captain Blake. Good to see you. We were just concluding some business. Elena studied the scarred stranger with interest. There was something about his manner, calm, observant, dangerous, that suggested military or law enforcement experience. But more than that, there was something in his eyes when he looked at her that was different from the other townspeople. Not acceptance necessarily, but not the automatic rejection she had grown accustomed to. Mrs. Whitman, however, seemed less pleased by the newcomer's arrival. Captain Blake, I don't believe we've been properly introduced to this person. Eleanor straightened, preparing to defend herself once again, but Captain Blake spoke first. Ma'am, I don't believe introductions are necessary unless the lady chooses to make them. A person's name is their own to give or withhold. The simple statement carried implicit criticism of Mrs. Whitman's presumptuous behavior, and Eleanor felt a flicker of gratitude toward this scarred stranger, who had shown her more courtesy in 30 seconds than the others had managed in the entire confrontation. Elena Martinez, she said, offering her hand. I'm pleased to meet you, Captain Blake. He accepted her handshake with a firm grip, his scarred face showing no reaction to her Spanish accent or obvious mixed heritage. Daniel Blake. The pleasure is mine, Miss Martinez. The exchange seemed to further agitate Mrs. Whitman. Captain Blake, surely you understand the delicate nature of this situation. This woman came here under false pretenses, attempting to deceive Mr. Patterson into an inappropriate marriage. Daniel Blake's expression didn't change, but something dangerous flickered in his dark eyes. False pretenses? In what way? She failed to mention her Indian blood, Mrs. Whitman said, as if stating an obvious crime. Mr. Patterson, naturally, assumed he was corresponding with a proper Christian woman. I see. Blake's voice remained calm, but Elena detected steel beneath the surface. And what exactly makes someone a proper Christian woman, Mrs. Whitman? Is it the color of their skin, or is it the content of their character? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Elena realized that this scarred stranger was deliberately inserting himself into a conflict that had nothing to do with him. She wondered why a man who clearly preferred to avoid attention would risk social disapproval to defend someone he had just met. James Patterson cleared his throat nervously. Captain Blake, I appreciate your perspective, but this is really a private matter between Miss Martinez and myself. Blake turned his attention to the merchant, and Elena saw something shift in his demeanor. A subtle hardening that suggested James Patterson was being evaluated and found wanting. Private matter, Blake repeated thoughtfully, like the kind of private matter where a man makes promises to a woman. She travels hundreds of miles based on those promises. And then he abandons her in a strange town because he's more concerned about what the neighbors will think than about keeping his word. The accusation was delivered in the same quiet tone, but its impact was devastating. James Patterson's face went red, while Mrs. Whitman looked scandalized that anyone would dare question their moral authority. "Sir, you have no right to interfere in this situation," Mrs. Whitman declared. The standards of this community, Blake interrupted, his voice still dangerously quiet, should include keeping one's word and treating visitors with basic human decency. If those aren't among your standards, Mrs. Whitman, then perhaps your community needs better standards. Elena watched this exchange with growing amazement. In the space of a few minutes, this scarred stranger had challenged the very people who had been systematically destroying her hopes, and he had done it with a calm authority that left them fumbling for responses. But she also recognized the danger. He was placing himself in. Defending her would mark him as an outsider, someone who didn't share the community's values. In a small town like Willow Creek, such social isolation could be devastating. "Captain Blake," she said quietly, "while I appreciate your courtesy, I don't want to cause problems for you with your neighbors." He turned to look at her, and for a moment she saw something in his scarred face that took her breath away. Not pity, not condescension, but recognition, as if he understood exactly what it meant to be judged by appearances rather than actions. "Miss Martinez," he said, "a man who won't stand up for what's right when it matters isn't much of a man at all. And a community that judges people by their bloodline rather than their character isn't much of a community." The words were a direct challenge to everything James Patterson and Mrs. Whitman represented, and Elena realized that Captain Daniel Blake had just declared himself her ally in front of witnesses who would undoubtedly spread the story throughout Willow Creek within hours. As the confrontation reached its climax, Elena found herself wondering who this scarred stranger really was, and why he would risk his own standing in the community to defend a woman he had just met. Whatever his motivations, his intervention had transformed her situation from hopeless isolation to something that might, just might, offer a different kind of future than she had originally planned. The war for Elena Martinez's place in Willow Creek was just beginning, but for the first time since stepping off that stagecoach, she wasn't facing it alone. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The tension in Patterson's general store had reached a breaking point when Captain Daniel Blake made his decision. Stepping forward with the measured calm of a man accustomed to taking control of difficult situations, he addressed Elena directly, while ignoring the shocked expressions of the other townspeople. "Miss Martinez, if I may suggest, you'll need lodging while you consider your options. The Frontier Hotel is clean and reasonably priced. Mrs. Sarah Coleman runs it, and she's fair in her dealings." Elena looked into his scarred face, searching for any hint of the ulterior motives she had learned to expect from men offering assistance. But there was something in his dark eyes, a straightforward honesty that seemed genuine, though guarded. "That's very kind of you, Captain Blake, but I'm afraid my resources are quite limited. The journey here consumed most of my savings." Mrs. Whitman seized the opportunity to interject with false concern. "You see, she's already become a burden on the community. This is exactly what happens when people make unrealistic plans based on romantic notions." Blake's expression hardened as he turned to face the older woman. "Mrs. Whitman, a person's financial situation after being deceived and abandoned doesn't reflect on their character. It reflects on the character of those who put them in that position." The rebuke was delivered with such quiet authority that Mrs. Whitman actually took a step backward. Elena realized that Captain Blake commanded a respect in this community that went beyond mere politeness. There was something about him that made even the most self-righteous townspeople think twice before challenging him directly. James Patterson, however, seemed to find his voice again. "Captain Blake, I appreciate your humanitarian instincts, but this situation is more complicated than you understand. Miss Martinez misrepresented herself in our correspondence." "Did she?" Blake's voice remained calm, but Elena detected a dangerous edge. "In what specific way?" "She failed to mention her mixed heritage," Patterson replied, as if stating something obvious. "A man has a right to know what he's getting into." Blake studied Patterson with the same analytical gaze Elena had noticed when he first entered the store. When he spoke, his words were measured and deliberate. "Mr. Patterson, I've read the territorial marriage laws. They require disclosure of existing marriages, criminal history, and infectious diseases. I don't recall any requirement to provide a detailed genealogy. What law exactly did Miss Martinez violate?" The question caught Patterson off guard. He glanced around the store as if seeking support, but found none forthcoming. Even Mrs. Whitman seemed uncertain how to respond to such a direct legal challenge. "It's not about law," Patterson finally stammered. "It's about honesty, about trust." "Trust." Blake repeated the word as if tasting something bitter. "Like the trust Miss Martinez placed in your written promises. The trust that led her to spend her life savings traveling here to marry you?" Elena watched this exchange with growing fascination. Captain Blake was systematically dismantling Patterson's justifications with the precision of a skilled lawyer, forcing the merchant to confront the hypocrisy of his position. "Furthermore," Blake continued, "I'm curious about your business practices, Patterson. Do you verify the ancestry of every customer before selling them goods? Do you require proof of pure bloodlines before accepting payment?" The sarcasm was subtle, but unmistakable, and Elena saw several other customers in the store beginning to look uncomfortable. Blake was highlighting the selective nature of Patterson's prejudice, willing to take money from people he considered socially unacceptable, but unwilling to honor personal commitments to them. Mrs. Whitman tried to regain control of the situation. "Captain Blake, surely you understand that business dealings are different from marriage. A merchant can serve anyone, but a wife becomes part of a man's family, his social circle. There are standards to consider." Blake turned his attention to her with the same analytical stare. "Standards, Mrs. Whitman? What standards are those? The standard that judges people by their actions and character, or the standard that judges them by the color of their skin and the circumstances of their birth?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Elena realized that Blake was forcing the townspeople to articulate their prejudices openly rather than hiding behind euphemisms and social conventions. It was a masterful strategy that made the racism appear as ugly as it actually was. "I think we all know what standards I mean," Mrs. Whitman replied stiffly. Civilized standards, Christian standards. Christian standards, Blake repeated thoughtfully, like the standard that says we should welcome strangers and treat them with kindness? The standard that says we should judge people by the content of their hearts rather than the color of their skin? Those Christian standards. Elena realized that Blake wasn't just defending her. He was conducting a public education in moral philosophy, using the townspeople's own professed values against their prejudiced behavior. It was brilliant, and it was working. She could see doubt creeping into some of the faces around the store, but she also recognized the danger he was placing himself in. By challenging the community's racial attitudes so directly, he was marking himself as an outsider, someone who didn't share their values. In a small town like Willow Creek, such social isolation could be devastating. "Captain Blake," she said, quietly, "while I appreciate your intervention, I don't want to cause problems for you with your neighbors." He turned to look at her, and she saw something in his scarred face that surprised her. Not pity or condescension, but understanding. As if he knew exactly what it meant to be judged by appearances rather than actions. "Miss Martinez," he said, "a man who won't stand up for what's right when it matters isn't worth much. And I've learned that the opinions of people who judge others by their bloodline aren't worth much either." The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning, and Elena realized that Captain Blake was speaking from personal experience. Whatever had happened to scar his face, whatever battles he had fought, they had taught him something about the true measure of human worth. Mrs. Whitman seemed to sense that the conversation was slipping away from her control. "Captain Blake, I'm sure your military service has exposed you to different perspectives, but this is a respectable community with families to protect. We can't simply ignore the implications of mixed marriages." "What implications?" Blake asked. "That children might grow up understanding that worth isn't determined by race, that families might learn to value character over social status. Those sound like positive implications to me." Elena felt a flutter of hope in her chest. This scarred stranger was not only defending her right to be treated fairly, he was challenging the very foundations of the prejudice that had shaped her entire life. She had never heard anyone speak so eloquently about the absurdity of racial discrimination. James Patterson, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, tried to regain control. "Captain Blake, I respect your position, but this is really between Miss Martinez and myself. We need to discuss her situation privately." Blake's expression darkened. "Her situation? You mean the situation where you've stranded her in a town with no money and no prospects because you were too cowardly to honor your commitments?" The accusation was delivered with such quiet intensity that Patterson actually stepped backward. Elena realized that beneath Blake's calm exterior lay something dangerous, a capacity for violence that he kept carefully controlled, but that was unmistakably present. "Now see here," Patterson began, but Blake cut him off. "No, you see here, Patterson, Miss Martinez traveled hundreds of miles based on your written promises. She spent her life savings trusting your word. And now you want to abandon her because you're more concerned about what the neighbors will think than about keeping your commitments." The moral weight of Blake's words was crushing, and Elena could see that even Patterson's supporters were beginning to look uncomfortable. The simple truth was that the merchant had made promises he was now refusing to keep, and no amount of social justification could change that fundamental fact. But it was Blake's next words that truly surprised her. "Miss Martinez," he said, turning. "To face her directly, I have a proposition that might address your immediate difficulties." Elena felt her heart skip a beat. After everything that had happened, she was wary of any offers from men she barely knew. But there was something in Blake's manner, a straightforward honesty that seemed genuine. "What sort of proposition, Captain Blake?" "I own a small ranch about 5 miles outside town. It's not much, just a few hundred acres and a modest house, but it's peaceful and private. I also have business interests that require someone with skills in reading, writing, and keeping accounts." Elena's pulse quickened. He was offering her work, a chance to support herself independently rather than depending on marriage or charity. "What sort of business interests?" she asked carefully. "I provide security services for mining operations and cattle ranches throughout the territory. It's dangerous work that requires careful record-keeping, correspondence with clients, and management of supplies and equipment. I've been handling these tasks myself, but I could use someone with better organizational skills." The offer was practical and dignified, honest work that would allow her to support herself while remaining independent. But Eleanor was experienced enough to be cautious about offers that seemed too good to be true. "And what would be the terms of such employment?" she asked. Blake's answer was direct and businesslike. "Room and board at the ranch, plus $30 a month. The work is legitimate, the accommodations are respectable, and your safety would be guaranteed." Elena's mind raced. $30 a month was more than she had earned as a seamstress in Santa Fe, and the offer of room and board would eliminate her most pressing concerns about survival. But there were other considerations. "Captain Blake, I appreciate your offer, but I must ask, what would people say about a single woman living and working at your ranch? Wouldn't such an arrangement create exactly the sort of social complications you've been criticizing?" Blake's scarred face showed what might have been a slight smile. "Miss Martinez, I've learned that people will talk regardless of what you do. The question is whether you're going to let their opinions control your life, or whether you're going to make decisions based on what's right and practical." The philosophy was appealing, but Elena had lived her entire life dealing with the consequences of other people's opinions. She understood the social realities that Blake seemed willing to ignore. Mrs. Whitman, who had been listening to this exchange with growing horror, finally found her voice. "This is outrageous. Captain Blake, surely you can't be serious about such an inappropriate arrangement. A single woman living alone with a bachelor? The scandal would be enormous." Blake turned to face her with the same calm intensity he had shown throughout the confrontation. "Mrs. Whitman, what would be scandalous is allowing a decent woman to starve in the street because a man broke his promises to her. What would be scandalous is letting social conventions override basic human decency." "But the proprieties," Mrs. Whitman began. "The proprieties," Blake interrupted, "are less important than doing what's right. Miss Martinez needs work and shelter. I have both to offer. The arrangement is practical and beneficial to both parties." Elena found herself torn between hope and caution. Blake's offer represented a lifeline when she had been drowning, but accepting it would mean placing herself in a position of dependence on a man she barely knew. On the other hand, her alternatives were extremely limited. "Captain Blake," she said carefully, "your offer is generous, but I need to understand the full implications. Would this be a temporary arrangement while I establish myself, or would you expect a longer commitment?" "That would depend on how well the arrangement works for both of us," Blake replied. "If you prove capable and trustworthy, and if the work suits you, it could become permanent. If not, I'd help you find other opportunities." The fairness of his proposal was striking, especially compared to the treatment she had received from Patterson and Mrs. Whitman. Blake was offering her a chance to prove herself based on her abilities rather than her ancestry. But Elena had one more question, perhaps the most important one. "Captain Blake, why are you doing this? Why are you willing to risk social disapproval to help someone you've just met?" Blake was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying her face. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of personal experience that made Elena understand she was hearing something important. "Miss Martinez, I've spent enough time being judged by my appearance to understand what it means to be dismissed because of things beyond your control. I've also learned that the people whose opinions matter most are those who judge you by your actions rather than your circumstances." The words resonated with Elena in a way that surprised her. This scarred stranger understood something about her experience that even sympathetic people often missed. The exhausting burden of constantly having to prove your worth to people who had already decided you weren't worthy of consideration. "In that case," she said, making her decision, "I accept your offer, Captain Blake, with gratitude." The announcement sent a shocked murmur through the store. Mrs. Whitman looked scandalized, while James Patterson appeared torn between relief and guilt. But Elena found herself focusing on Blake's scarred face, seeing something there that she hadn't noticed before. Satisfaction, perhaps, or the quiet pleasure of having done something right in a world that often seemed determined to do wrong. As they prepared to leave Patterson's general store together, Elena realized that her life had taken a completely unexpected turn. She had come to Willow Creek expecting to marry James Patterson and build a conventional life as a merchant's wife. Instead, she was about to become the employee of a mysterious scarred ranger whose defense of her had already made him enemies among the town's social leaders. But for the first time since stepping off the stagecoach, Elena felt hope stirring in her chest. Captain Daniel Blake had proven that not everyone in Willow Creek was ruled by prejudice and social convention. Perhaps, with his help, she could build a different kind of life, one based on her abilities rather than other people's expectations. The war for Elena Martinez's place in Willow Creek was far from over, but she was no longer fighting it alone. Word of Elena Martinez's arrangement with Captain Daniel Blake spread through Willow Creek like wildfire across dry prairie grass. By the time they reached the Frontier Hotel to collect Elena's belongings, a small crowd had gathered on the wooden sidewalk, their whispered conversations creating a buzz of speculation and disapproval. Sarah Coleman, the hotel proprietor, was a weathered woman in her 50s with graying hair and intelligent blue eyes that had seen enough of frontier life to make her slow to judge. She met them at the front desk with professional courtesy, though Elena could see curiosity in her expression. "Captain Blake," Mrs. Coleman said warmly, "I heard you might be stopping by. Miss Martinez, I'm Sarah Coleman. I run this establishment." Elena accepted the handshake gratefully. "Mrs. Coleman, I appreciate your hospitality, even if it may be brief." "Nonsense," Mrs. Coleman replied briskly. "You paid for the room fair and square. No reason you can't collect your things in peace." She shot a meaningful glance toward the crowd, visible through the front windows. "Though I can't say the same for everyone in town." As Eleanor climbed the narrow stairs to retrieve her few possessions, she could hear the murmur of voices from the street growing louder. Through the upstairs window, she observed the gathering crowd with growing apprehension. What had begun as casual curiosity was transforming into something more organized and potentially dangerous. When she returned to the lobby with her single traveling bag, Captain Blake was standing at the front window, his expression grim. Mrs. Coleman approached them both with a concerned frown. "Captain, there's something you should know," she said quietly. "Mrs. Whitman sent her son, running to the church and the mayor's office right after you left Patterson's store. She's calling for what she terms community action to address the situation." Blake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What kind of community action?" "The kind that involves a lot of self-righteous people working themselves up into a righteous fury," Mrs. Coleman replied grimly. "I've seen it before. Good folks can turn mean real quick when they convince themselves they're protecting moral standards." Elena felt a chill of apprehension. She had experienced prejudice before, but it had usually been individual rejection, rather than organized community opposition. The prospect of facing an entire town's organized hostility was terrifying. "Perhaps I should reconsider Captain Blake's offer," she said quietly. "I don't want to bring trouble to anyone who's trying." To help me. Blake turned from the window to face her directly. Miss Martinez, backing down now would only prove to people like Mrs. Whitman that intimidation works. Is that the lesson you want them to learn? Before Elena could respond, the hotel door opened to admit a delegation of Willow Creek's most prominent citizens. Leading the group was Mayor Theodore Hutchinson, a portly man in his 60s with thinning grey hair and the self-important manner of someone who enjoyed wielding authority. Behind him came Mrs. Whitman, the Methodist minister Reverend William Morrison, and 3 other men Elena didn't recognize, but whose expensive clothing suggested wealth and influence. Mayor Hutchinson approached with the measured stride of a man delivering an official pronouncement. Captain Blake, Miss Martinez, I'm Theodore Hutchinson, Mayor of Willow Creek. I understand there's been some irregular arrangements made today that have caused concern among our citizens. Blake's expression remained calm, but Eleanor detected the same dangerous edge she had noticed in Patterson's store. Mayor Hutchinson, what specific irregularities concern you? The mayor glanced around the hotel lobby as if ensuring he had an audience for his performance. Well, sir, it's been brought to my attention that you've offered employment and lodging to this young woman under circumstances that raise questions about propriety and community standards. I've offered honest work to someone who needs it. Blake replied evenly, I wasn't aware that required community approval. Reverend Morrison stepped forward, his thin face bearing the stern expression of a man convinced of his own moral authority. Captain Blake, surely you understand that a Christian community has an obligation to maintain certain standards of behavior. The arrangement you're proposing would place an unmarried woman of questionable background in your household without proper supervision or chaperonage. Eleanor felt anger rising in her chest at the casual dismissal of her character, but Blake spoke before she could respond. Reverend Morrison, what exactly makes Miss Martinez's background questionable? She's educated, skilled, and seeking honest employment. Those seem like positive qualities to me. You know perfectly well what we're referring to, Mrs. Whitman interjected sharply. Her mixed blood, her deceptive correspondence with Mr. Patterson, her willingness to travel across the territory seeking marriage to a stranger. These are not the actions of a respectable woman. Blake's voice remained calm, but Elena could see tension in his shoulders. Mrs. Whitman, Miss Martinez's heritage is no more questionable than anyone else's. Her correspondence with Patterson was honest about everything that mattered, and seeking marriage through letters is perfectly legal and increasingly common on the frontier. Mayor Hutchinson raised his hand in a gesture meant to restore order. Gentlemen, ladies, let's not get bogged down in details. The simple fact is that the arrangement Captain Blake proposes would be scandalous. An unmarried woman living alone with a bachelor, regardless of the work involved, violates basic standards of decency. Elena found her voice, her anger overriding her caution. Mayor Hutchinson, what would you suggest as an alternative? Should I starve in the street to preserve your community's sense of propriety? The mayor's face reddened at the direct challenge. Miss Martinez, there are proper institutions for women in your situation. Charitable organizations, religious missions, places where you could receive appropriate guidance and supervision. You mean places where I could be controlled and reformed according to your standards, Elena shot back. Places where my mixed heritage could be properly suppressed and my independence eliminated. Reverend Morrison stepped forward again, his voice taking on the cadence of a sermon. Miss Martinez, pride is a sin. The Christian path requires humility and acceptance of proper authority. Fighting against God's natural order only leads to suffering. Blake's intervention was swift and cutting. Reverend, I must have missed the biblical passage that establishes skin color as part of God's natural order. Could you cite the specific verse? The challenge left Morrison fumbling for a response, his theological certainty crumbling under direct scrutiny, Elena realized that Blake was employing the same strategy he had used in Patterson's store, forcing people to articulate their prejudices openly rather than hiding behind vague moral platitudes. Mrs. Whitman tried to regain control of the conversation. "Captain Blake, you're being deliberately obtuse. This isn't about theology or legal technicalities. It's about what kind of community we want Willow Creek to be. Do we want to be known as a place where proper standards are maintained, or as a place where anyone can do anything they please, regardless of social consequences? I'd rather live in a place known for fairness and opportunity than a place known for prejudice and exclusion," Blake replied. "But that's apparently where we differ." Elena watched this exchange with growing amazement and concern. Blake was single-handedly taking on the entire power structure of Willow Creek, defending principles that most people were unwilling to even discuss. But she also recognized the danger he was creating for himself. One of the men Elena didn't recognize stepped forward, a well-dressed individual with calculating eyes and the bearing of successful businessmen. "Captain Blake, I'm Jonathan Mitchell, president of the Willow Creek Cattlemen's Association. I've heard you do security work for various ranching operations in the territory." Blake nodded warily. "That's correct." Mitchell's smile was cold and predatory. "Interesting. I wonder how many of those ranchers would continue to employ someone who openly flouts community standards and associates with questionable individuals. Business relationships depend on trust and shared values, don't they?" The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Mitchell was suggesting that Blake's defense of Elena could cost him his livelihood. Elena felt her stomach drop as she grasped the implications. Blake was risking everything to help her, and she was about to become the cause of his professional ruin. "Mr. Mitchell," she said quickly, "Captain Blake's offer of employment was kind, but perhaps not practical under the circumstances. I wouldn't want my situation to damage his business relationships." Blake turned to look at her, and she saw something in his scarred face that surprised her. Not relief at her offer to withdraw, but disappointment, as if her willingness to back down had revealed something he hadn't expected. "Miss Martinez," he said quietly, "a man's business relationships aren't worth much if they depend on compromising his principles." Mitchell's smile broadened. "Principles are admirable, Captain Blake, but they don't pay bills or put food on the table. Perhaps you should consider the practical implications of your charitable impulses." Elena realized that the confrontation was escalating beyond personal prejudice into economic warfare. The town's power structure was using Blake's livelihood as a weapon to force compliance with their social standards. Mayor Hutchinson seemed to sense an opportunity to conclude the matter. "Captain Blake, I'm sure you're a reasonable man. The community is simply asking you to reconsider an arrangement that would set a poor precedent and cause unnecessary social friction. Surely Miss Martinez can find more appropriate accommodation." "Where?" Blake asked bluntly. "Patterson has made it clear she's unwelcome as his intended wife. You've made it clear she's unwelcome in the community, so where exactly do you expect her to go?" The question hung in the air, exposing the fundamental cruelty of their position. They wanted Elena gone, but were unwilling to take responsibility for the consequences of their rejection. Reverend Morrison provided the answer they were all thinking, but didn't want to say aloud. Perhaps she should return to wherever she came from. Santa Fe has more diverse populations that might be more accepting of her situation. "With what money?" Elena asked. "I spent everything I had getting here based on Mr. Patterson's promises. You want me to leave, but you've made it impossible for me to do so." The practical reality of her situation seemed to make some of the delegation uncomfortable, but Mrs. Whitman remained unmoved. "That's unfortunate, but it's not the community's responsibility to solve problems created by inappropriate expectations and poor planning." Blake's voice cut through the discussion like a blade. Mrs. Whitman, the only inappropriate expectations here were Patterson's expectation that he could break his promises without consequences. The only poor planning was his failure to honor his commitments. Eleanor could see that the confrontation was reaching a critical point. The town's leaders had made their position clear. She was unwelcome, and anyone who helped her would face social and economic consequences. Blake had made his position equally clear. He would not be intimidated into abandoning his principles. But Elena also recognized that Blake was fighting a battle he couldn't win. The combined economic and social pressure of the entire community power structure would eventually destroy him, and she would be responsible for that destruction. "Captain Blake," she said firmly, "I appreciate your defense more than I can express, but I won't be the cause of your ruin. Perhaps there's another solution we haven't considered." Before Blake could respond, Mrs. Coleman cleared her throat loudly. The hotel proprietor had been listening to the entire exchange with growing irritation, and her weathered face now showed open anger. "Mayor Hutchinson," she said sharply, "this is my establishment, and I'll thank you to remember that. Miss Martinez is a paying guest, and Captain Blake is a respected customer. If you want to continue this discussion, you can do it outside." The mayor looked startled by the unexpected intervention. "Mrs. Coleman, surely you understand the community's concerns. I understand that a bunch of people who should know better are bullying a young woman who's done nothing wrong," Mrs. Coleman replied, "and I understand that you're threatening a man's livelihood because he has the courage to stand up for what's right." Elena realized that Blake and Mrs. Coleman weren't the only people in Willow Creek who disagreed with the town's racial attitudes, but she also understood that they were vastly outnumbered by those who preferred conformity to justice. Mayor Hutchinson straightened his vest with obvious irritation. "Mrs. Coleman, the community's moral standards," Mrs. Coleman interrupted, "should include treating visitors with basic decency and keeping promises once they're made. If those aren't your standards, maybe you need different standards." Elena watched this exchange with growing amazement. In the space of one afternoon, two people had risked their own standing in the community to defend her right to be treated fairly. She had never experienced such principled support from strangers. But she also recognized the danger they were all facing. The power structure of Willow Creek had made its position clear, and anyone who opposed that position would face consequences. Blake's business relationships were already being threatened, and Mrs. Coleman's hotel could face similar pressures. As the delegation prepared to leave, Mayor Hutchinson delivered what was clearly meant as a final warning. "Captain Blake, Miss Martinez, I hope you'll both consider the implications of defying community standards. Willow Creek is a small town, and people have long memories." The threat was unmistakable, and Elena felt the weight of despair settling over her. She had traveled across the territory seeking a new life, only to find herself at the center of a conflict that threatened to destroy anyone who tried to help her. But Blake's response surprised her once again. "Mayor Hutchinson," he said quietly, "I've faced worse things than social disapproval, and I've learned that the people whose memories matter most are those who remember acts of courage, not acts of cowardice." As the delegation filed out of the hotel, Elena realized that the battle lines had been drawn. On one side stood the established power structure of Willow Creek, united in their determination to maintain racial and social conformity. On the other side stood a scarred ranger, a determined hotel proprietor, and a half Apache woman who had become the symbol of everything they opposed. The war for Elena Martinez's place in Willow Creek had escalated beyond personal prejudice into organized community opposition. But Elena was beginning to understand that this fight was about more than just her future. It was about what kind of community Willow Creek would become, and whether justice could triumph over prejudice in the American frontier. The ride to Captain Blake's ranch took them through some of the most beautiful country Elena had ever seen. Rolling hills covered with golden grass stretched toward distant mountains that rose like ancient guardians against the azure sky. The late afternoon sun painted everything in warm amber light, creating a landscape that seemed almost magical after the tension of Willow Creek. Blake rode with the easy grace of a man born to the saddle, his scarred face relaxed for the first time since Elena had met him. He had provided her with a gentle mare named Stella and a side saddle, though Elena's Apache heritage had taught her to ride astride when necessary. "It's beautiful country," she said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them as they traveled. "It is," Blake agreed. "That's why I chose to settle here after my army discharge. There's something about this land that heals a man's spirit if he lets it." Eleanor detected a note of personal experience in his words. "You were in the army?" Blake nodded, his expression growing more serious. 10th Cavalry. "We served in campaigns against hostile Apache bands in southern Arizona and New Mexico territories." Elena felt a complex mix of emotions at this revelation. The 10th Cavalry, the famous Buffalo Soldiers, had fought against her mother's people, yet here was one of their former officers offering her sanctuary when her own kind of people had rejected her. "Did you know my mother's people?" she asked carefully. "The Chiricahua Apache?" Blake was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "I knew them, Miss Martinez, fought against them, respected them, and eventually came to understand them better than most white soldiers ever did." "And what did you understand?" "That they were fighting for their homeland, their families, their way of life, same things any man would fight for." He paused, then added quietly, "I also understood that there were no easy answers to the conflicts between our peoples." Elena appreciated his honesty. Most white men she had encountered either romanticized or demonized the Apache. Blake seemed to understand the complexity of the situation without taking refuge in simple moral judgments. As they crested a low hill, Blake's ranch came into view. It was modest but well-maintained, a single-story adobe house with a wide front porch, a sturdy barn, and several outbuildings arranged around a central courtyard. The setting was peaceful and private, surrounded by gently rolling pasture land dotted with cattle. "It's not much," Blake said, apparently reading her expression. "But it's home. It's lovely," Eleanor replied, and meant it. After the hostility of Willow Creek, the quiet ranch looked like paradise. As they dismounted near the barn, a Mexican man in his 50s emerged from one of the outbuildings. He was compact and weathered, with intelligent dark eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to responsibility. "Captain," the man said in accented English, "I was not expecting you back so soon." "Change of plans, Miguel," Blake replied. "Miguel Santana, I'd like you to meet Miss Elena Martinez. She'll be helping me with the business correspondence and record-keeping." Miguel's eyes widened slightly at Elena's Spanish surname, and she saw recognition there, not just of her heritage, but of the courage it must have taken for Blake to bring her here, given the territory's racial tensions. "Señorita Martinez," Miguel said formally, removing his hat. "Bienvenida. You are welcome. Here." The simple courtesy, delivered in Spanish, brought unexpected tears to Elena's eyes. After the day's hostility, Miguel's acceptance felt like a gift. "Gracias, Señor Santana," she replied. "I'm pleased to meet you." Blake gestured toward the house. "Miguel manages the ranch operations while I'm away on business. He and his wife Carmen live in the house by the creek. Carmen does most of the cooking and helps maintain the main house." As they walked toward the ranch house, Elena noticed the careful way Blake moved, alert, controlled, with the unconscious habits of a man who had lived with danger. She wondered what experiences had shaped him, what battles he had fought both, in the army and after. The interior of the house surprised her with its comfort and refinement. The main room featured handcrafted furniture, Navajo rugs, and bookshelves lined with volumes that suggested wide-ranging interests. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and large windows provided views of the surrounding countryside. The office is through here, Blake said, leading her to a smaller room that contained a large desk, filing cabinets, and more bookshelves. This is where you'd be working. Correspondence with clients, maintaining records of contracts and payments, organizing, supplies and equipment. Elena examined the office with professional interest. Blake's current filing system was functional but basic, clearly the work of a man more comfortable with action than paperwork. "What sort of security services do you provide?" she asked. Blake settled into the chair behind his desk, suddenly looking tired. "Mostly guarding mining operations and cattle drives. The territory is still dangerous. Bandits, hostile Indian bands, cattle rustlers. Mining companies and large ranchers hire me to protect their investments. That must require you to travel extensively." "Several weeks out of every month," Blake confirmed, "which is why I need someone reliable to handle the business end of things. The correspondence alone has been overwhelming." Elena could see the scope of the challenge. Blake's business was clearly successful, but his absence on security assignments left administrative tasks unmanaged. A competent assistant could probably double his efficiency and profits. "Captain Blake," she said carefully, "I need to ask you something directly. Why are you really doing this? The offer of employment, the defense against the townspeople, what do you gain from helping me?" Blake leaned back in his chair, studying her with those dark, intelligent eyes. "Miss Martinez, do you want the polite answer, or the honest one?" "The honest one, please. I've spent enough time being judged by my scars to understand what it's like when people decide your worth based on your appearance. I've also seen enough of frontier justice to know that fairness is rare and courage is rarer. When I saw you, standing up to Patterson and Mrs. Whitman with dignity and intelligence, I recognized something worth defending." Eleanor felt something stir in her chest at his words. Not just gratitude, but a deeper appreciation for this complex man who seemed to understand things about her that she rarely acknowledged even to herself. "There's something else," Blake continued. "I've been alone on this ranch for 2 years, and the isolation has been difficult. Having someone intelligent to talk with, someone who could help build something meaningful here, that would benefit me as much as it would help you." The admission revealed a vulnerability that Elena hadn't expected. This confident, dangerous man was lonely, and her presence would address that loneliness as much as her skills would help his business. "In that case," she said, "I believe we can help each other." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the front door. Blake rose with the quick alertness of a man accustomed to danger, his hand instinctively moving toward the gun at his hip. "Wait here," he said quietly, moving toward the front room. Elena heard voices, Blake's calm tone and another man's urgent speech. After a few minutes, Blake returned with a weather-beaten rancher who looked like he had ridden hard to get there. "Miss Martinez, this is Tom Bradley. He owns the Circle B ranch about 20 miles east of here. Tom, Miss Elena Martinez, my new business associate." Bradley nodded respectfully to Elena, but his attention was focused on Blake. "Captain, I need your help. We've got a situation developing that could turn nasty real quick." "What kind of situation?" Blake asked. "Rustlers hit my north pasture 3 nights ago, took about 50 head of prime cattle, but that's not the worst part. I found tracks suggesting they're heading toward the San Carlos reservation." Elena felt a chill of apprehension. Apache reservations were volatile places where any incident could trigger larger conflicts. Blake's expression grew grim. "You think they're trying to blame the Apache for the theft?" "That's exactly what I think," Bradley confirmed. "And there's Been talk in town about organizing a posse to go after them. Some folks are saying it's time to teach the Indians a lesson about respecting white man's property. Elena realized with growing horror that she was witnessing the kind of situation that had led to countless tragedies on the frontier. Cattle rustlers using racial tensions to cover their crimes, while white communities use theft as an excuse for violence against Indian populations. "Who's organizing this posse?" Blake asked. "Jonathan Mitchell from the Cattlemen's Association is pushing for it. Says we can't let the Apache think they can steal with impunity. Mayor Hutchinson is supporting him, and they've got a lot of the younger men worked up about defending their property." Elena realized that the same people who had threatened Blake's business that afternoon were now preparing to use cattle theft as an excuse for violence against her mother's people. The injustice was staggering. "Tom," Blake said carefully, "have you considered that Mitchell might have reasons for wanting conflict with the Apache that go beyond cattle theft?" Bradley looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" "I mean that some people profit from Indian troubles, government contracts for military supplies, opportunities to grab reservation land, political careers built on fighting savages. Mitchell's been pushing for expansion of cattle grazing onto reservation lands for months." Elena watched this conversation with growing understanding. Blake wasn't just talking about abstract political corruption. He was explaining how racial hatred could be manufactured and exploited for economic gain. "Captain," Bradley said slowly, "are you suggesting that Mitchell might be involved in the rustling?" "I'm suggesting that we should find out who really stole your cattle before anyone starts shooting at Apache," Blake replied. "Once bullets start flying, innocent people die and the truth gets buried." Elena found her voice. "Mr. Bradley, my mother was Chiricahua Apache. If you're right about this being a setup, my people will pay the price for crimes they didn't commit." Bradley looked at her with new interest. "You're Apache?" "Half Apache," Elena confirmed. "And I know that most of the Apache on the San Carlos reservation are peaceful farmers trying to build new lives. They wouldn't risk everything by stealing cattle." Blake nodded approvingly at her intervention. "Tom, Miss Martinez has first-hand knowledge of Apache culture and customs. Her insights could be valuable in determining the truth about these thefts." Elena realized that Blake was positioning her as an expert consultant rather than just a secretary. He was creating a role for her that utilized her unique background and knowledge. "What do you propose?" Bradley asked. Blake stood, his demeanor shifting to the focused intensity Elena had seen when he confronted the townspeople. "I propose we investigate these thefts properly before anyone starts a war. Miss Martinez and I will track the stolen cattle and determine who really took them. Once we have facts instead of assumptions, we can decide on appropriate action." Elena felt her pulse quicken. Blake was suggesting they work together as partners in a dangerous investigation that could prevent violence between whites and Apache. It was exactly the kind of meaningful work she had hoped to find. "Are you sure about this, Captain?" Bradley asked. "If Mitchell is involved, investigating him could be dangerous." Blake's scarred face showed a slight smile. "Tom, I've been shot at by professionals. A crooked cattleman doesn't scare me, and if the Apache really are involved, then we'll deal with that when we know for certain," Blake replied. "But we won't condemn people based on prejudice and assumption." As Bradley prepared to leave, he turned to Elena with obvious respect. "Miss Martinez, I appreciate your willingness to help. Your people and mine have had our differences, but maybe it's time to try understanding instead of fighting." After Bradley departed, Elena found herself alone with Blake in the gathering twilight. The events of the day had transformed her from a rejected mail-order bride into a business partner in an investigation that could prevent a racial conflict. "Captain Blake," she said, "this morning I was a desperate woman with no prospects. Tonight, I'm your business associate preparing to investigate cattle rustling and prevent violence between our peoples." How did my life change so completely in one day? Blake looked at her across the lamp-lit room, his scarred face thoughtful. Sometimes life changes when you meet the right person at the right moment. Sometimes courage and circumstances align to create new possibilities. Elena felt something shift in the air between them. Not romance, not yet, but recognition of partnership and mutual respect that could potentially grow into something deeper. In that case, she said, I suggest we begin planning our investigation. If we're going to prevent a war, we'll need to move quickly. Blake nodded, and Eleanor saw satisfaction in his expression. Welcome to the team, partner. As they began planning their strategy, Elena realized that her partnership with Daniel Blake represented far more than employment or convenience. It was the alliance between two people who had been judged and rejected by conventional society, now working together to create their own definition of justice and worth. The war for Elena Martinez's place in Willow Creek had evolved into something larger, a fight for truth, justice, and the possibility that people from different worlds could build something meaningful together. Dawn broke grey and threatening over Blake's ranch, with storm clouds gathering on the western horizon like an omen of the troubles ahead. Elena had risen early, unable to sleep after the previous day's revelations about the cattle rustling and the potential for racial violence. She found Blake already in the kitchen, studying maps and drinking coffee that looked strong enough to dissolve iron. Any new developments? She asked, accepting the cup he offered. Tom Bradley sent word before sunrise, Blake replied grimly. The posse is forming up this morning. Mitchell convinced Mayor Hutchinson and half the town council that immediate action is necessary to protect white settlers from Apache raids. Elena felt her stomach drop. How many men? About 20, including some hotheads who've been looking for an excuse to fight Indians since the Apache wars ended. Blake's scarred face was grim in the early morning light. They're planning to ride out to the San Carlos reservation by noon. Elena realized that their window for investigation was rapidly closing. Once the posse reached the reservation, any chance of preventing violence would disappear in gunfire and blood. We need to find those cattle before the shooting starts, she said. Blake nodded, rolling up the maps. I've been studying the trail Tom described. The rustlers were smart. They drove the cattle toward the reservation boundary, but there are several canyons and hidden valleys where they could have diverted the herd without leaving obvious tracks. Eleanor examined the map, her Apache heritage, providing insights that most white trackers would miss. This area, she said, pointing to a series of narrow canyons, has water and grass, but it's hidden from the main trails. If I were hiding stolen cattle, that's where I'd take them. My thoughts exactly, Blake agreed, but there's a problem. Getting there requires crossing Mitchell's own grazing land. If he's involved in the rustling, we'll be riding directly into danger. Before Elena could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their planning. Blake moved to the window, his hand instinctively going to his sidearm. 3 riders, he reported. Moving fast. Elena joined him at the window, recognizing the lead rider as Tom Bradley. But the other 2 men were strangers, rough-looking individuals with the hard eyes and casual violence of professional troublemakers. Captain Blake, Bradley called as he dismounted. We need to talk. Blake stepped onto the porch, Elena following. Despite his gesture for her to remain inside, she had become his partner in this investigation, and she wouldn't be relegated to the role of protected female. Bradley approached with obvious agitation, while his 2 companions remained mounted, their eyes scanning the ranch buildings with professional assessment. Captain, there's been a development, Bradley began. These gentlemen represent certain business interests in the territory. They have information about the cattle rustling that changes everything. The taller of the mounted men spoke with the flat accent of a professional gunman. Name's Jack Morrison. My associate here is Pete Walker. We work security for various mining and cattle operations throughout Arizona Territory. Elena noticed that Morrison's name was the same as Reverend Morrison from Willow Creek, though the two men bore no resemblance beyond sharing surnames. Blake's expression remained neutral, but she could see tension in his shoulders. "What information do you have, Mr. Morrison?" Blake asked. Morrison's smile was cold and predatory. "Information that might save you from making some serious mistakes. Captain, word is you're planning to interfere with legitimate law enforcement efforts to recover stolen property. Planning to investigate cattle theft before innocent people get killed," Blake replied. "If that interferes with law enforcement, maybe law enforcement needs better planning." Walker, the second gunman, finally spoke. His voice carried the harsh rasp of a man who had been shot in the throat and survived. "Captain Blake, some folks think you might be too sympathetic to the Apache cause, might be letting personal feelings cloud your professional judgment." Eleanor felt a chill of recognition. These weren't random enforcers. They were specifically targeting Blake because of his defense of her and his willingness to question the rush to blame the Apache. "What personal feelings?" Blake asked, though Eleanor could see he already understood. The implication. Morrison's gaze shifted to Eleanor with undisguised contempt. "Well, Captain, you did take in that half-breed woman despite community objections. Some folks wonder if your judgment might be compromised." The racial slur hit Elena like a physical blow, but Blake's response was swift and dangerous. "Mr. Morrison," he said quietly, "I'd advise you to choose your words more carefully. Miss Martinez is a lady, and I expect her to be treated as such." Morrison's hand moved closer to his gun. "Or what, Captain? You going to draw on both of us to defend your Apache woman?" Elena realized that the confrontation was rapidly escalating toward violence. These men had come here specifically to provoke Blake into a gunfight, probably with orders to kill him if possible. "Gentlemen," she said firmly, stepping forward despite Blake's protective gesture, "perhaps we should focus on the cattle theft rather than personal insults." Walker laughed harshly. "The Apache squaw wants to talk about cattle theft. That's rich. Maybe you should ask your reservation friends where Tom Bradley's cattle ended up." Elena felt anger flare in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. These men were trying to provoke both her and Blake into making mistakes that would justify their violence. Tom Bradley, who had been looking increasingly uncomfortable, finally found his voice. "Now hold on, boys. Miss Martinez is trying to help solve this situation. No call to get personal about it." Morrison turned his cold stare on Bradley. "Tom, you hired us to provide security for your ranch and recover your stolen cattle. Are you having second thoughts about following through?" Elena realized with growing horror that Bradley hadn't brought these gunmen as allies. He had hired them as enforcers, and they were now using his cattle theft as an excuse to eliminate Blake and herself. "I hired you to find my cattle," Bradley said defensively, "not to start wars with neighbors or insult ladies." "Sometimes those things go together," Walker replied with ugly satisfaction, "especially when neighbors and ladies might be involved. In the theft themselves." The accusation hung in the air like poison. Elena understood that she was being set up as an accomplice in the cattle rustling, her Apache heritage providing the perfect justification for suspicion. Blake's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "That's enough. You've made your position clear, gentlemen. Now I suggest you leave my property before this conversation becomes unpleasant." Morrison's smile widened. "Captain Blake, I don't think you understand the situation. We represent significant business interests in this territory, people who don't appreciate interference with their operations." "What operations?" Elena asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer. Walker answered with brutal honesty. Operations that require occasional conflict between whites and Indians to justify government contracts and land acquisitions. Operations that can't afford to have people asking too many questions or providing alternative explanations for convenient incidents. Elena felt the pieces of the conspiracy falling into place. The cattle rustling wasn't just about theft. It was about creating justification for violence against the Apache that would serve larger economic and political purposes. "You're manufacturing a war," she said with growing horror. "We're protecting American interests," Morrison replied coldly. "Sometimes that requires decisive action against hostile populations." Blake stepped protectively in front of Elena. "Gentlemen, you've overstayed your welcome. I'm asking you to leave. Once." Morrison's hand moved to his gun. "Captain, you're making a serious mistake. Interfering with legitimate security operations could be considered treason, especially if you're taking the side of hostiles against American citizens." "The only hostiles I see," Blake replied, "are the ones pointing guns at law-abiding people on their own property." Elena realized that Blake was outnumbered and outgunned, facing professional killers who had been sent specifically to eliminate him. She had to do something to change the odds. "Mr. Morrison," she said loudly, "I suppose your employers wouldn't want the territorial governor to know about their plans to manufacture Indian troubles for profit." The bluff worked. Morrison's eyes narrowed with sudden concern. "What do you know about territorial politics, Squaw?" "I know that Governor Fremont has been trying to establish peaceful relations with reservation tribes," Elena replied, improvising based on newspaper accounts she had read. "I also know that he wouldn't appreciate private citizens creating conflicts that embarrass his administration." Walker shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Elena sensed that she had touched on something important. These men were operating without official sanction, and exposure could destroy their employers' political connections. "You're bluffing," Morrison said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "Am I?" Elena asked. "Captain Blake has extensive contacts throughout the territory from his army service. How difficult would it be for him to get word to the governor about a conspiracy to manufacture Apache troubles?" Blake picked up her strategy immediately. "Miss Martinez is right, Morrison. I served under Colonel Henderson, who's now military advisor to the territorial government. One telegram from me could bring federal investigators down on this entire operation." Elena saw doubt creeping into the gunmen's faces. They had come expecting to intimidate or kill an isolated rancher and his Apache woman. Instead, they were facing someone with military connections and political leverage they hadn't anticipated. But Morrison wasn't ready to back down completely. "Captain Blake, you're making powerful enemies, people who can destroy your business, your reputation, your entire life in this territory. People have been trying to destroy my life for years," Blake replied calmly. "I'm still here." Tom Bradley, who had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm, finally spoke up. "Morrison, this isn't what I hired you for. I wanted my cattle back, not a war with the territorial government." Morrison turned his cold stare on Bradley. "Tom, you hired us to handle your problems. Are you having second thoughts about the methods?" Elena realized that Bradley was beginning to understand the true scope of what he had gotten involved in. The rancher looked genuinely shocked by the revelation of the larger conspiracy. "I never agreed to manufacturing wars or threatening government officials," Bradley said firmly. "Find my cattle, but do it legally." Walker laughed harshly. "Tom, there's no legal way to get your cattle back from Apache thieves. Sometimes justice requires extra legal methods." "We don't know that Apache took the cattle," Elena interjected. "That's what we're trying to investigate." Morrison's patience finally snapped. "Listen, Squaw, your people have been stealing and murdering since before you were born. Don't lecture us about Apache innocence." Blake's response was swift and deadly quiet. "Mr. Morrison, I warned you about your language regarding Miss Martinez. Consider this your final warning." Elena saw Morrison's hand tighten on his gun, and she realized that the confrontation was about to explode into violence. But before anyone could draw, the sound of approaching riders interrupted the tense standoff. A group of 5 horsemen crested the hill, approaching Blake's ranch, riding at a steady pace that suggested official business rather than emergency. Elena recognized the lead rider as Sheriff Tom Watson from Willow Creek, a decent man caught between competing pressures. Morrison and Walker exchanged glances, clearly unhappy about the arrival of official law enforcement. Their operations worked, better in shadows than under legal scrutiny. Sheriff Watson dismounted and approached the group with the careful demeanor of a man trying to prevent violence rather than investigate crime. "Captain Blake, gentlemen," he said formally, "we've had reports of tensions regarding the cattle rustling situation. I'm here to ensure that all investigations proceed according to legal procedures." Elena realized that Watson's arrival might be their salvation, or it might be the final trap. Everything would depend on whether the sheriff was part of the conspiracy or genuinely trying to maintain law and order. Blake stepped forward to address Watson directly. "Sheriff, these gentlemen have been making threats against Miss Martinez and myself for attempting to investigate cattle theft before anyone starts shooting Apache." Watson's expression grew serious. "What kind of threats, Captain?" Morrison intervened smoothly. "Sheriff Watson, we're private security working for Mr. Bradley to recover his stolen cattle. We were simply advising Captain Blake about the dangers of interfering with legitimate recovery operations." Eleanor realized that Morrison was trying to position their intimidation as professional advice rather than criminal threats. But she had one card left to play. "Sheriff Watson," she said clearly, "these men have been discussing plans to manufacture conflicts with Apache tribes to serve unnamed business interests. They've also made it clear that they consider investigating the actual facts of the cattle theft to be treasonous interference." Watson's eyes narrowed with interest. Elena had framed the situation in terms of law enforcement versus conspiracy, forcing the sheriff to choose sides publicly. "Is that accurate, Mr. Morrison?" Watson asked. Morrison's response was too quick and too defensive. "Sheriff, Miss Martinez is obviously trying to protect her Apache friends by making wild accusations against legitimate businessmen." Eleanor saw Watson's expression change subtly. The sheriff was beginning to understand that there were larger forces at work in this situation. "In that case," Watson said formally, "I think we need to sort this out at the county courthouse with proper legal procedures and sworn testimony." Elena realized that Sheriff Watson had just declared himself on the side of law and order rather than conspiracy and intimidation. The tide of the confrontation had shifted decisively in their favor, but she also understood that this was just the beginning of their troubles. Morrison and Walker represented forces that wouldn't be deterred by one sheriff's intervention. The systematic destruction of Blake's life, and her own, was just getting started. Sheriff Watson's intervention had temporarily diffused the standoff at Blake's ranch, but Elena knew their reprieve would be short-lived. As Morrison and Walker reluctantly departed with barely concealed threats, she realized that their enemies would simply regroup and attack from a different angle. "We need to find those cattle today," she told Blake as they watched the dust cloud from the departing riders. "Before they have time to organize another assault." Blake nodded grimly. "Tom, are you still willing to help us find the truth? Or has this gotten too dangerous for you?" Bradley looked shaken by the morning's revelations about the men he had hired. "Captain, I had no idea what Morrison and Walker really represented. I just wanted my cattle back, not some territorial conspiracy." "Then help us find them," Elena said firmly, "before innocent people die for crimes they didn't commit." Sheriff Watson, who had remained behind after dismissing the gunman, cleared his throat meaningfully. Captain Blake, Miss Martinez, I think there are some things you should know about what's really happening in Willow Creek. Elena felt her pulse quicken. Watson's tone suggested he possessed information that could change everything. What kind of things, Sheriff? Blake asked. Watson glanced around nervously, as if expecting hidden observers. The kind of things that could get a man killed if the wrong people found out he was talking. Can we speak privately? Blake led them into his ranch house, posting Miguel as a lookout. Once they were seated around his kitchen table, Watson's professional demeanor cracked to reveal genuine fear. Captain Miss Martinez, you're dealing with something much bigger than cattle rustling or even racial prejudice. There's a consortium of Eastern investors who've been buying up territorial politicians and businessmen to gain control of mineral rights and grazing lands. Eleanor leaned forward with growing interest. What kind of consortium? Railroad men, mining companies, cattle barons from Texas and Colorado? They call themselves the Southwestern Development Corporation, but they're really just a front for grabbing as much territorial wealth as possible before statehood changes. The rules, Blake's scarred face showed grim understanding, and creating conflicts with Apache tribes serves their purposes by destabilizing territorial government and creating opportunities for land seizures. Exactly, Watson confirmed. Every time there's Indian trouble, the territorial government grants emergency powers and land concessions to protect white settlers. The consortium has been manufacturing these emergencies for 2 years. Elena felt pieces of a massive puzzle falling into place. That's why they reacted so strongly to my presence in Willow Creek. It wasn't just racial prejudice, it was because I represent a threat to their carefully constructed narrative about Apache dangers. Watson nodded approvingly. An intelligent, educated woman of mixed Apache heritage challenges everything they've been telling people about Indian threats. If folks saw you as an individual rather than a stereotype, they might start questioning other assumptions about Apache people. Who in Willow Creek is part of this conspiracy? Blake asked. Watson's answer confirmed Elena's worst suspicions. Jonathan Mitchell from the Cattlemen's Association is the local coordinator. Mayor Hutchinson takes orders from him, though he probably doesn't understand the full scope of the operation. Mrs. Whitman is a true believer who thinks she's protecting white civilization, but she's really just a useful tool. Elena realized that her rejection by the town's power structure had been systematic rather than random. Every obstacle placed in her path had been designed to eliminate a threat to their larger scheme. What about James Patterson? She asked. Patterson's just a coward, Watson replied with disgust. Mitchell probably told him that associating with you would hurt his business, and Patterson folded like a cheap tent. Blake leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. Sheriff, how do you know all this, and why are you telling us? Watson's expression grew haunted. Because I've been investigating suspicious activities for months, trying to understand why so many Indian incidents seemed convenient for certain business interests. Last week I finally got proof. He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio. Mitchell was careless with his correspondence. One of his letters fell out of his saddlebags at the livery stable, and the hostler brought it to me thinking it might be important. Elena examined the letter Watson handed her, her heart racing as she read the contents aloud. The Martinez situation must be resolved immediately. The woman's presence in Willow Creek undermines our carefully constructed narrative about Apache threats. Used whatever methods necessary to eliminate her influence and discredit Blake's interference. Blake's jaw tightened with controlled fury. They've been planning to destroy us from the moment Elena stepped off that stagecoach. There's more, Watson continued, producing additional documents. Orders to Morrison and Walker to resolve the Apache problem permanently if the cattle rustling doesn't provide sufficient justification for military action against the reservation. Elena felt sick as she grasped the full implications. They're planning a massacre, That's exactly what they're planning, Watson confirmed grimly. Create enough Indian trouble to justify a military expedition that would clear Apache off valuable mineral lands permanently. Tom Bradley, who'd been listening with growing horror, finally spoke. My God, what have I gotten involved in? Those men I hired, they're not trying to recover stolen cattle. They're trying to start a war. Tom, Blake said quietly, your cattle might not even be stolen. This whole situation could be fabricated to create the excuse they needed. Elena's mind raced with new possibilities. Sheriff Watson, has anyone actually verified that cattle are missing? Or have we all been assuming Tom's word? Bradley looked stricken. I found evidence of rustling in my north pasture. Tracks, signs of a large herd being driven away. But I suppose those could have been faked. Watson nodded thoughtfully. Miss Martinez raises a good point. Creating false evidence of cattle theft would be much easier than actually stealing and hiding 50 head of cattle. Elena stood and began pacing Blake's kitchen, her Apache heritage providing insights that the white men might miss. If I wanted to fake cattle rustling, I'd drive a small herd in circles to create confusing tracks, then hide the cattle temporarily in a location where they could be easily retrieved later. That's brilliant, Blake said with admiration. Stage the theft, create panic about Apache raids, then recover the cattle after the military expedition has cleared the reservation. Bradley slumped in his chair, the full scope of his manipulation becoming clear. Captain Blake, Miss Martinez, I owe you both a profound apology. I've been a fool, and my foolishness nearly got you killed. Elena felt sympathy for the honest rancher who had been used by forces beyond his understanding. Mr. Bradley, evil men count on deceiving good people. The fault lies with them, not with you. Sheriff Watson consulted his pocket watch with obvious urgency. We need to act quickly. The posse is forming up in Willow Creek as we speak. Once they ride out to the reservation, we won't be able to stop what happens next. Blake stood with military decisiveness. Sheriff, what legal authority do you have to stop the posse? Not enough, Watson admitted. Mitchell has convinced Mayor Hutchinson to deputize the posse members as special constables. Technically, they'll be acting under legal authority. Elena. He saw the trap closing around them. Even if they could prove the cattle rustling was fake, the posse would already be en route to the reservation with legal sanction for their actions. Then we need evidence so compelling that even Mitchell can't ignore it, she said. We need to find those cattle and prove they were never stolen. Blake nodded. Elena's right. If we can demonstrate that the entire crisis was manufactured, we can expose the conspiracy and stop the violence. Tom Bradley straightened with new resolve. Captain, Miss Martinez, I want to help. This is my fault for trusting the wrong people, and I need to make it right. Elena felt a flicker of hope. With Bradley's help, they might be able to locate his cattle quickly enough to prevent the massacre being planned at the reservation. Tom, she said, you know your land better than anyone. Where would be the best place to hide 50 head of cattle temporarily? Bradley considered the question seriously. There's a box canyon about 5 miles northeast of the north pasture. It has water, grass, and only one way in or out. Perfect for holding cattle without them wandering off. Blake was already reaching for his rifle. How long to get there? 2 hours hard riding, Bradley replied. But if Mitchell's people are guarding the cattle, we could be riding into an ambush. Elena realized they were facing an impossible choice. They had to find the cattle to prove the conspiracy, but searching for them could be suicide if Morrison and Walker were waiting. Sheriff Watson provided an unexpected solution. I can't officially support your investigation, but I can create a distraction that might draw Mitchell's men away from wherever they're hiding the cattle. What kind of distraction? Blake asked. Watson's smile was grimly satisfied. I'm going to arrest Jonathan Mitchell on suspicion of conspiracy to to incite violence against territorial tribes. That should create enough chaos to keep his people busy. Elena felt admiration for the sheriff's courage. Arresting Mitchell would end Watson's career and possibly his life, but he was willing to make that sacrifice to prevent a massacre. "Sheriff, that's incredibly brave, but it's also incredibly dangerous," she said. "Miss Martinez," Watson replied, "I became a peace officer to protect innocent people, not to enable conspiracies against them. If I don't act now, I'll never be able to live with myself." Blake clasped Watson's hand in farewell. "Sheriff, if we don't make it back, make sure the territorial governor knows what really happened here." "You'll make it back," Watson said with conviction. "You've both proven you're too stubborn to die easily." As they prepared to depart for their dangerous search, Elena realized that the next few hours would determine not just their own fate, but the fate of hundreds of Apache families who had no idea they were about to become victims of manufactured hatred. The hidden truth was finally being revealed, but whether they could act on that truth in time to prevent tragedy remained to be seen. Elena Martinez had arrived in Willow Creek as a rejected mail-order bride, but she was about to become something far more important. A woman whose courage and intelligence might prevent a war built on lies and greed. The race against time had begun, and everything, their lives, their love, and the lives of innocent people hung in the balance. The box canyon that Tom Bradley had described lay hidden behind a maze of red rock formations, accessible only through a narrow defile that could easily be defended by a single gunman. As Elena, Blake, and Bradley approached on horseback, the afternoon sun cast long shadows that provided both concealment and danger, perfect cover for ambushes. "There," Bradley whispered, pointing toward the canyon entrance. "If my cattle are anywhere, they'll be in there." Blake dismounted and studied the approach with military precision. "The entrance is a natural bottleneck. If Mitchell's people are guarding the cattle, they'll have positioned themselves to control that passage." Elena examined the surrounding terrain with eyes trained by her Apache heritage to read landscape like a book. "There's another way," she said quietly. "See that game trail along the ridge? It leads around to the back of the canyon. The Apache have used routes like that for generations." Blake followed her gaze and nodded approvingly. "Brilliant. Tom, you stay here with the horses. If shooting starts, ride for Willow Creek and tell Sheriff Watson what happened." "Captain, I should come with you," Bradley protested. "This is my responsibility." "Your responsibility is to make sure the truth gets told if we don't make it back," Elena said firmly. "Someone needs to witness what we find here." As Elena and Blake made their careful way up the hidden trail, she found herself thinking about how much her life had changed in just 3 days. She had arrived in Willow Creek as a desperate woman seeking marriage to a stranger. Now she was scaling canyon walls to prevent a massacre, working as an equal partner with a man she was beginning to love. The trail was treacherous, requiring careful placement of every step on loose shale and crumbling rock. But Elena's Apache blood served her well. Her mother's people had been moving through such terrain for centuries, and the skills had been passed down even to those who lived between two worlds. "There," Blake whispered as they reached a vantage point overlooking the canyon floor. Below them, 50 head of cattle grazed peacefully in the hidden valley, watched over by 2 armed guards who were clearly bored with their assignment. The cattle bore Tom Bradley's brand, confirming that they had indeed been stolen, but not by Apache raiders. Elena studied the guards with tactical assessment learned from Blake's example. "They're not expecting trouble from this direction. We could probably get close enough to hear their conversation." Blake nodded, and they began their careful descent toward the canyon floor. The guards were positioned near the canyon's single entrance, leaving the cattle relatively unguarded, at the far end where Elena and Blake approached. As they drew closer, voices became audible. Elena recognized one speaker as Pete Walker, the harsh-voiced gunman from the morning's confrontation. "Should have killed Blake and the squaw when we had the chance," Walker was saying. "Now Watson's got Mitchell locked up, and the whole plan's falling apart." His companion, a man Eleanor didn't recognize, spat into the dust. "Morrison says we stick to the plan. Drive these cattle back to Bradley's range tonight, then claim we recovered them from Apache raiders. The posse's already riding toward the reservation." Elena felt her blood run cold. The massacre was proceeding even while they were discovering proof of the conspiracy's lies. Blake gestured for silence and began moving closer to the guards. Elena understood his intention. They needed to capture at least one of the conspirators alive to provide testimony that could stop the violence. But as Blake rose from concealment to approach the guards, a loose rock betrayed his position. Walker spun toward the sound, his gun already clearing leather with professional speed. "Company!" Walker shouted, firing toward Blake's position. Eleanor reacted with Apache instincts, rolling behind a boulder as bullets whined off the canyon walls. Blake returned fire, his military training evident in his controlled, accurate shots. The second guard tried to flank Blake's position, but Elena had anticipated the move. Rising from her concealment, she threw a fist-sized rock with deadly accuracy, striking the man in the temple and dropping him unconscious. Walker, seeing his partner fall, made a desperate attempt to reach the canyon entrance and escape. But Blake's next shot took him in the leg, sending him tumbling to the ground with a cry of pain and fury. "It's over, Walker," Blake called out, advancing with his rifle trained on the wounded gunman. "You're going to tell the truth about this conspiracy." Walker's response was to reach for his fallen pistol, but Elena was faster. Her booted foot kicked the weapon away, leaving the gunman helpless and defeated. "You think this changes anything?" Walker snarled through gritted teeth. "The posse's already riding toward the reservation. By tonight, there won't be any Apache left to testify about anything." Elena felt desperation clawing at her chest. Even with proof of the conspiracy, they might be too late to prevent the massacre. Blake seemed to read her thoughts. "Elena, we need to get back to town immediately. This evidence means nothing if innocent people die while we're collecting it." They quickly secured Walker and his unconscious partner, then began the dangerous descent from the canyon with their prisoners. Tom Bradley was waiting with barely concealed anxiety. "Did you find them?" he asked. "We found your cattle and the proof of who really stole them," Elena replied. "But the posse is already en route to the reservation. We may be too late to stop what's coming." Bradley's face went pale. "How long do we have?" Blake consulted his pocket watch. "The posse left Willow Creek 2 hours ago. They'll reach the San Carlos reservation by sunset. If we ride hard, we might intercept them, but it'll be close." Elena realized that their fight was entering its final, most dangerous phase. They had the evidence to expose the conspiracy, but they had to survive long enough to present it. The race back to Willow Creek was a blur of pounding hooves and desperate urgency. Walker, wounded and tied to his saddle, alternated between threats and attempts to bargain for his freedom. "You don't understand what you're messing with," he kept saying. "The Southwestern Development Corporation has people in the territorial government, the Army, even Washington. Killing me won't stop what's coming." Elena ignored his attempts at intimidation. She had learned that courage meant continuing to do what was right, even when the odds seemed impossible. Willow Creek was in chaos when they arrived. Sheriff Watson had indeed arrested Jonathan Mitchell, but the action had split the town into armed camps. Mitchell's supporters were demanding the sheriff's removal, while a smaller group of citizens were beginning to question the rush to violence against the Apache. Elena could see the battle lines drawn along Main Street. Mitchell's faction gathered outside the jail demanding his release, while Mrs. Coleman and other business owners who valued justice over prejudice had formed a counter-demonstration. Blake rode directly to the jail where Sheriff Watson was barricaded with his prisoner. The building was surrounded by an angry crowd led by Mrs. Whitman and several of Mitchell's business associates. "Sheriff Watson," Blake called out as they approached. "We have evidence that will end this situation." Mrs. Whitman turned toward them with fury blazing in her eyes. "Captain Blake, you and that Apache woman have caused enough trouble. Mitchell is a respected businessman, not a criminal." Elena dismounted and faced the crowd with calm dignity. Over the past 3 days, she had learned that backing down from prejudice only encouraged more prejudice. "Mrs. Whitman," she said clearly, "we have proof that Mr. Mitchell and his associates manufactured the cattle rustling to justify violence against innocent Apache families." The crowd's reaction was immediate and hostile. Shouts of "liar" and "Apache sympathizer" filled the air, but Elena noticed that some faces showed doubt rather than automatic rejection. Blake gestured toward their prisoners. "Walker here has confessed to stealing Tom Bradley's cattle on Mitchell's orders. The entire crisis was fabricated to create an excuse for military action against the reservation." Tom Bradley stepped forward to address the crowd directly. "Folks, I'm the one whose cattle was supposedly stolen. These men convinced me that Apache raiders were responsible, but the truth is they stole my own cattle to create false evidence." The revelation sent murmurs through the crowd. Bradley was known as an honest rancher, and his testimony carried weight with people who might dismiss Elena and Blake as outsiders, but Mrs. Whitman wasn't ready to abandon her prejudices. "Even if that's true, it doesn't change the fact that this woman and her people represent a threat to our community's values." Elena felt anger rising in her chest, but she forced herself to respond with dignity rather than emotion. "Mrs. Whitman, what threat do I represent? I came here seeking honest work and the chance to build a life through marriage. When that was denied because of my heritage, I found other honest work. Where is the threat in that?" Before Mrs. Whitman could respond, a new voice cut through the crowd's murmur. "The threat is to people who profit from keeping communities divided by hatred and fear." Elena turned to see a distinguished man in his 50s approaching on horseback, accompanied by a small group of riders wearing territorial marshal badges. The man's bearing and the deference shown by his escorts suggested official authority. Sheriff Watson emerged from the jail, his relief obvious. "Judge Hamilton, thank God you're here." Judge Hamilton dismounted and surveyed the crowd with keen intelligence. "Sheriff Watson, I received your telegram about organized conspiracy to incite violence against reservation tribes. I've brought territorial marshals to investigate these serious allegations." Elena realized that Sheriff Watson had been more strategic than any of them had understood. By contacting territorial authorities, he had ensured that the local conspiracy would face federal investigation. Mitchell's supporters began to look nervous as the federal marshals took positions around the crowd. Mrs. Whitman's defiant expression wavered as she grasped that her local influence meant nothing to territorial authorities. Judge Hamilton addressed the crowd formally. "Citizens of Willow Creek, you will disperse immediately and allow federal officers to conduct their investigation. Anyone interfering with this investigation will be arrested for obstruction of justice." Elena watched as the crowd reluctantly began to break up, but the real victory came when several townspeople approached her and Blake directly. "Miss Martinez," said a middle-aged woman Elena recognized from church services, "I owe you an apology. I let other people's prejudices influence my judgment, and that was wrong." Similar apologies came from other citizens who had remained silent during the persecution, but were now finding the courage to speak for justice. Elena realized that not everyone in Willow Creek had been against her. Many had simply been afraid to oppose the town's power structure. The final validation came when Judge Hamilton interviewed Elena privately about her role in exposing the conspiracy. "Miss Martinez," he said, "your intelligence and courage may have prevented a massacre that would have disgraced the territory. The federal government owes you a debt of gratitude." Elena felt tears of relief and vindication in her eyes. "Judge, Hamilton, I did nothing more than any citizen should do when confronted with injustice." "Perhaps," the judge replied, "but few citizens have the courage to act on their convictions when the cost could be their lives." As the federal investigation proceeded, the full scope of the Southwestern Development Corporation's conspiracy was revealed. Mitchell and his associates had been systematically manufacturing conflicts throughout the territory to justify land seizures and military contracts. Elena watched with satisfaction as Walker and his surviving associates were taken into federal custody. The evidence they provided would destroy the conspiracy and protect countless innocent lives. But the personal victory was even sweeter. As the dust settled on the dramatic confrontation, Blake approached her with an expression she had never seen before. Not just respect or partnership, but love. "Elena," he said quietly, "3 days ago, you were a stranger looking for a new life in an unfamiliar place. Today, you're the woman who helped save my community from itself. Somewhere in between, you became the woman I want to spend my life with." Elena felt her heart soar. This scarred, courageous man had seen her true worth when everyone else saw only her mixed heritage. More than that, he had helped her discover her own strength and purpose. "Daniel," she replied, using his first name for the first time. "3 days ago, I thought I needed a husband to give my life meaning. Today, I've learned that I needed a partner to help me discover what my life could become." Their first kiss was witnessed by half of Willow Creek, including Mrs. Whitman, who watched with obvious discomfort, but no longer dared to voice her disapproval. 6 months later, Elena Martinez Blake stood in her own dressmaking shop on Main Street, serving customers from throughout the territory who appreciated quality work over social prejudice. Her marriage to Daniel had been performed by Judge Hamilton himself, with Sheriff Watson and Mrs. Coleman as witnesses. The shop bore a sign reading, "Blake and Associates, Fine Clothing and Territorial Security Services." Elena had insisted on the partnership being reflected in their business name, just as it was reflected in their marriage. Tom Bradley had become one of their closest friends. His honest remorse for his initial mistakes transformed into unwavering support for their success. Even James Patterson had eventually approached Elena with an apology, though she had politely declined his suggestion that they might reconsider their original arrangement. Mrs. Whitman still lived in Willow Creek, but her influence had been broken by the exposure of the conspiracy she had unknowingly supported. She nodded politely when she encountered Eleanor on the street, but the days of open hostility were over. Eleanor's greatest satisfaction came from the letters she received from Apache families on the San Carlos Reservation, thanking her for preventing the massacre that would have destroyed their community. Her mixed heritage, once seen as a source of shame, had become a bridge between worlds that desperately needed understanding. As Elena worked in her shop one evening, creating a wedding dress for another woman brave enough to build a new life, on the frontier, Daniel returned from a security assignment with news that made her smile. "The territorial governor wants to hire us as official consultants on Indian affairs," he reported. "Apparently, our success in preventing the Mitchell conspiracy has impressed people in very high places." Elena looked up from her sewing with satisfaction. She had arrived in Willow Creek as a rejected mail-order bride, desperate and dependent on others' charity. She was building a future as a successful businesswoman and respected citizen, equal partner in love and work with a man who valued her, mind as much as her heart. "What do you think?" Daniel asked. "Ready to take on the territorial government?" Elena Martinez Blake smiled at her husband, her scarred ranger who had seen her true worth when no one else would. "Partner," she said, "I'm ready for anything, as long as we face it together." Outside their window, The lights of Willow Creek twinkled like stars, no longer representing rejection and prejudice, but opportunity and hope for anyone brave enough to fight for what they believed in. Elena had learned that true worth wasn't determined by ancestry or social acceptance, but by the courage to stand up for justice regardless of the cost. Her story had begun with desperate hope and apparent rejection. It ended with love, success, and the knowledge that sometimes the greatest victories come to those who refuse to let others define their worth. The mail-order bride, who had been rejected for being half Apache, had become the woman whose courage saved her community and whose love story proved that worth is determined by character, not by the color of one's skin or the circumstances of one's birth. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.